Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the fifth lecture in the series Men, Women and Guitars in Romantic England. And today, my subject is, for me, one of the most moving and engaging aspects of the guitar fashion of the early 19th century. So my title is Harmony in the Lowest Home, the Guitar and the Labouring Poor. But before we go any further, I'd like to introduce to you the musicians who are going to perform for us. They are Ulrich Wiedemeyer and Timothy Reynolds. Now, I begin with a story that was doing the rounds of the newspapers and periodicals in the mid-1830s, and I quote, "A lady who kept a seminary in Somers Town was in want of a housemaid. She advertised, and many called to offer their services. The lady was pleased with the appearance of one and entered into an agreement with her, requesting her to come to her place without delay. The girl seemed as if she had something on her mind, and after a great effort, she said she would require to go out twice a week for the first month. 'Oh,' said the lady, 'you attend some particular chapel, I conclude.' 'Oh no,' said the girl, 'I'm learning the guitar, and I've paid for a quarter's instruction in advance, and I wouldn't like to lose my lessons.' Well, history doesn't record the name of that housemaid, so I can't visit her grave and lay flowers upon it as I'd really like to. I mean, how can one not admire her? Her work will be poorly paid and menial, for she will be, as a housemaid, essentially a cleaner. In the words of a contemporary manual addressed to housemaids, she will have to contend against a host of enemies: dust, soot, smoke, rust, insects of various kinds, and bad smells innumerable. Nonetheless, she's somehow found the money for guitar lessons, and at a time when the task of winning any kind of concession or indulgence from an employer required courage, easily interpreted as impertinence, she is not afraid to speak. She pays the price for it and finds herself once more unemployed in a world without a welfare state." Well, I'd like you now to consider another guitarist within the working population. The first page of your little handout shows an anonymous caricature entitled "The March of Intellect" from 1831. The scene, well, you can see, can't you, is a poor dwelling, still with the casement windows of old London, not sashes, where an elderly laundress, clearly undernourished and dressed in rags, is sitting in what is perhaps the only room of her lodging. Some laundry is boiling in a pot on the range. More hangs drying beneath the stained and the patched ceiling. The room is full of steam, no doubt playing havoc with the tuning of the guitar that she's trying to play. Painfully unlike the young girls in their prime, who are so often associated with the guitar in contemporary engravings and portraits, she sings to her own accompaniment. The score of the song lies on the floor, and we can read, in the original anyway, that it's the popular ballad "My Heart with Love is Beating" from The Siege of Belgrade, a comic opera that premiered in 1791. Nearby lies a bill advertising the amateur concert. This is all legible in the original, in which she hopes to take part, with the word amateur cruelly misspelt by the cartoonist. Now, laundry work, often done in the home and then returned to the customer, was, as I'm sure many of you already know, one of the most common forms of employment for relatively poor women in 19th century England. You took the washing in and did it at home and then delivered it. And such women ranked even lower than housemaids. Now, I wouldn't care to say whether laundresses actually did play the guitar in London during the 1830s. I'm inclined to think that they probably didn't. I mean, a laundress was prone to various kinds of skin condition, as you can imagine, that principally affected the hands. And I would have thought that would make performance on a musical instrument like the guitar really rather difficult, to say nothing of the want of time during the working day, or for many laundresses, the working night as well, for a luxury such as performance on a musical instrument. And to judge by the newspaper advertisements of the period, it was men who dominated the amateur concerts. So what's being satirised? Well, a hand-coloured lithograph of about 1840, which is on the second page of your handout, suggests to me a similar question. Here you've got a chimney sweep with a guitar. It's entitled Music Hath Charms, and it shows him serenading, I suppose, the scullery maid who's sitting by the range. Well, I think my answer would be that these caricatures, like the story of the housemaid that I began with, respond to a development traceable from the 1820s onwards, which involved much more than the guitar. If you look again, if you will, at the first page of the handout, the title of the picture showing the laundress, which you can read just about, is The March of Intellect. Now that phrase appears more than 2,000 times in the newspapers and periodicals of the 19th century. The British Newspaper Archive returns more than 200 hits for the phrase from the year 1831 alone, when the caricature appeared. The expression, which some of you may be familiar with, was often used in a polemical context to denote any aspect of progress in science or education, especially the education of the disadvantaged, which a commentator might wish to lampoon, not necessarily with a malicious intent, or to ridicule. The provision of gas lamps in the public streets, evening classes for workers, liberal ideas opposed to the entrenched privileges of the grander farmers and landowners, and we might add, guitar lessons for housemaids or laundresses. These were signs of the march of intellect and could be judged very differently according to the interests of the observer. And in our caricature, the use of that expression, the march of intellect, is clearly ironic. For insofar as the term often implied progress, well, if there's any sign of progress here, you might think it's of the wrong sort, at least in the judgment of the artist. The washing in the saucepan on the range is boiling over, so that the water falls and hisses on the coals below, producing a huge plume of steam. The long spoon used for stirring the laundry is falling down to the dismay of the cat and is about to crash down on the bare flagstones of the floor. And this is all because the woman has quite literally turned her back on her work. It's all meant to be humorous, and I don't think this would have been called in its own day a satirical picture. When a version was published in a newspaper, indeed, it was called a fancy sketch, which sounds rather less mordant, doesn't it, than a satire. But the picture is capable of a cruel, and I admit, a rather humorless interpretation. The pastime of playing the guitar is as absurd in one so base as the performance of a love song is as grotesque in one so old. It's also damaging, for this, the picture seems to be saying, is what the march of intellect comes to. Laundresses, chimney sweeps, housemaids, and other members of the labouring underclass acquiring a better conceit of themselves and neglecting the menial but vital employments to which they were born. Will this not eventually lead to restlessness, to radicalism, and then perhaps to riot? To some, however, it seemed that the march of intellect was virtually synonymous with the onward march of Great Britain. So we read in an issue of a newspaper called the Argus from 1828, "These are eventful times. The march of intellect, often misunderstood and as often misrepresented, is nevertheless advancing with rapid strides. The schoolmaster is abroad, and the powerful influence of intellectual improvement is daily imparting new light, the light of national liberty, as freely as the sunbeams of heaven, to every part of the British Empire." Well, this begins to reveal, I think, the scope of the kind of argument I'd like to put to you this afternoon. The guitar has, I think, a place in the social, economic and political changes that took place in England during the first half of the 19th century. Now, I don't mean to imply that the guitar ever became the principal instrument of the labouring poor. I think, or the small artisan. I think that cheap fiddles, violins, flutes and fifes, often homemade, did that, often perhaps purchased from a street vendor. But I do wish to suggest that circumstances arose in which the guitar was uniquely able to move between different social classes in a way that cheap flutes and fiddles, to be distinguished from well-made and expensive violins, were not. The guitar was therefore deeply engaged with the aim of self-improvement and education among the poor, with the march of intellect in a certain sense of that phrase. Well, who were the poor? Were the workers in the factories of the Midlands and the North, the new urban proletariat among them? Yes, certainly. And it was no doubt on the backs of their labour that the guitar achieved its ascendancy amongst the mercantile gentry of manufacturing centres like Birmingham and Manchester in the 1830s. That could have been a subject for another lecture. But here, and I follow the historian Eric Hobsbawm, the most active, militant and politically conscious of the labouring poor were not the new factory proletarians, but the skilled craftsmen, independent artisans, small-scale domestic workers, and others who lived and worked substantially as they had done before the Industrial Revolution in small workshops, but under far greater pressure. During the 1830s, evidence for the spread of the guitar amongst these people begins to accumulate, and our housemaid was surely one of Hobsbawm's small-scale domestic workers, and the beginning of the decade brings what is perhaps the most important example. Let me explain. In 1831, the printer Henry Hetherington began a radical weekly, The Poor Man's Guardian, at a penny per issue. An illegal publication, in fact, that advocated universal suffrage, factory legislation, and trade union rights. On the 13th of October, 1832, the newspaper advertised the reopening of a school. Here's the advertisement, word for word. Mr. Wise's school was reopened on Monday, October the 8th. The children will be taught popular astronomy, chemistry, geography, algebra, logarithms, arithmetic, writing, violin, flute or guitar, to copy music and to sing correctly the rational and liberal songs now published, and to read in French and perfectly understand some of the best works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Well, as the mention of Rousseau suggests, the ambitions of Mr. Wise's school shouldn't, I think, be underestimated. But why choose the guitar for such a school? I would like to begin my answer with a piece of music. It's a simple and very appealing song that was published with accompaniment for the guitar in 1795. The melody was quite well known, in fact, and there's even a set of variations upon the theme by Beethoven. So this is A Shepherd Loved a Nymph So Fair from 1795.
A shepherd loved a nymph so fair, fa la la, la 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 la, and thus his passion did declare, fa la la, la 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 la. For thee, dear maid, I long in vain have sighed, nor ventured to complain. Oh, now consent to ease my pain, fa la la, la 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 la. La 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 la. For thee I'll college early sweet, fa la la, la 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 la, to lay their treasures at thy feet, fa la la, la 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 la. Each varied flower that decks the spring, to yield their beauties I will bring. While o'er thy head each bird shall sing, fa la la, la 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 la. Tender heart, fa la la, la 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 la. We'd join again no more to part, fa la la, la 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 la. With thee I tread the daisied mead to view the herds and flocks that feed, and home at eve thy footsteps lead, fa la la, la 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 la, la 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 la. With blushing sweetness thus the maid, fa la la, la 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 la, his honest passion brief repaid, fa la la, la 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 la. I long, dear youth, thy love have known, by every tender kindness shown. Then take my hand, my heart's your own, fa la la, la 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 la.
I'll soon be explaining to you why I chose that. Let me just say now first that in 1834, our instrument made an appearance in the Casket, one of the penny magazines sold for about the price of a pint of beer or half an hour's wage labour. And the editors ran a piece that they called The Conveniences of the Guitar, which they took with acknowledgement from the Julianiad, the first niche magazine for guitarists in English that I've often had cause to mention in the course of my lectures. What was the convenience of the guitar exactly? Well, in addition to advantages I've often had cause to mention, such as portability, the guitar was the only cheap instrument that could provide the kind of harmonic accompaniment that you've just heard. On the 17th of May in that same year, 1834, the penny magazine of the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, a London magazine with a weekly circulation that's been calculated as about 200,000 at its peak, had this to say: "But if we were to recommend an instrument to be made sufficiently cheap, if possible, for the working classes of this country, it should be the guitar. The author recommended that the difficulty of tuning could be simplified by the sale of separate tuning forks for each string." Again, there's obviously no question of there being any pianos amongst those he has in mind. And although, now I quote again, "the guitar admits of very little, either of tone or execution, yet that little is what is technically called harmony. That is, proper combinations of notes can be struck at once, and in this it would be superior to the flute or the clarinet, which only produce melody, that is, the simple consecutive notes which make up the air. Next, the little that an ordinary player can ever hope to do on the guitar can be soon done. A very few lessons with a proper book of instructions would suffice to enable the beginner to please himself and others." It's easy to see, I think, what that author means. The simple song you heard a moment ago uses no more, really, than two principal harmonies. But to hear them and to play them is to have one's ear grounded in patterns of harmonic instability and repose, of departure and return, that have been at the heart of Western music ever since the emergence of tonal harmony in the 18th century. I mean the chords of 1 and 5, or if you prefer, and in this case, A major and E, a tonic and a dominant. I'd like you to hear a rather more sophisticated example straight away. This is a setting of the Bluebells of Scotland, one of the vast number of lilting tunes deemed, and for all I know rightly so, to be Irish, Scottish or Welsh, and known from street to salon. Here is what the guitar could offer players who applied themselves a little more. A clearly etched melody of a very lyrical cast with a simple but effective harmonic support of primary chords, the Bluebells of Scotland. As in all the musical examples in these lectures, that was played on an original guitar. It has no label, but we all agree that it's really quite early 19th century guitar, that one. Well, how would working people eager to buy a guitar find one that they could afford? Now here, I think, the role of the London coffee shops was of great importance, and I'd like to read you a passage of a dialogue transcribed from a government report of 1817 concerning law and order in London. The owner of a coffee shop is being asked about his trade. Do you keep a coffee shop? I do. I'm going to have some fun with this if you don't mind. I do come from East London myself, as you can probably tell. Can you inform the committee how long the establishment of coffee shops has been adopted? About 5 years. I believe there were very few before that time. From what cause did it originate? From the cheapness of coffee, and they met with encouragement from the great convenience they offered to working persons. Do you furnish newspapers? Yes, we have 4 a day. We have the Times, the Ledger, and the Morning Chronicle, and the Courier in the evening. Well, the coffee shops were sometimes presented as miniature and ideal societies for the exchange of ideas, as in the Crisis and National Cooperative Trades Union Gazette for August the 2nd, 1835. I quote, "The mechanicks' coffee room is a complete little republic, where warm arguments and good sense level all distinctions. And as the artisans, through being associated together in their workshops, have an opportunity of freely talking without interruption, they possess an admirable talent for conversation and debate, which many who consider themselves their superiors might feel glad to possess. So by the 1830s, working people unable to afford a subscription to a newspaper were able to read reviews of concerts, fulsome accounts of gentry music parties, notices placed by governesses offering to teach the guitar, advertisements for instruments, methods, and published music, all for nothing, or strictly speaking, for the price of the cup of coffee that they bought. They could also see announcements for forthcoming auctions, one of the most important ways, I suspect, in which people on the lower rungs of the economic ladder could obtain their guitars at a price within their means. All the main morning papers carried such advertisements of auctions, often giving a summary list of the main items to be sold, and guitars are often mentioned, both in the London and provincial papers. A second source of cheap instruments, of course, was the pawn shop. Charles Dickens refers to these, you may remember, as the receptacles for misery and distress with which the streets of London unhappily abound. But he acknowledges that some were more distinguished than others. Guitars seem to have passed in and out of pawn shops with some frequency, suggesting that members of the poorer classes who might rely on the pawnbroker to get through the week were acquiring them. A lute guitar, by now something of an oddity, lay in the window of a Portsea pawn shop in 1827 as an unredeemed pledge. And in 1831, an essay in the Manchester Times and Gazette imagined a guitar hanging on the wall of a pawnbroker's shop left by an impoverished apprentice to a hat maker. Now, I'm sure you all know that the manufacture of hats was one of the most dangerous trades of the time because of the mercury used in the production of felt, whence the expression mad as a hatter. And it's no surprise, I think, that hat makers were amongst the first working people to form a trade union. The apprentice in this case had apparently tried his hand as a professional guitarist to escape the curse of the hat-making profession and failed. A sorry tale, this, of someone who hoped that the guitar would lift him out of a difficult and dangerous labour, but found that it did not, with the result that it lay in a pawn shop for someone else to buy it and tempt some other unfortunate, perhaps, to go down the same path. Some other instruments found their way into pawn shops in the hands of thieves and swindlers. Since guitars were so eminently portable, they could be easily lifted away from shop window displays or carried out of music shops on trial, then taken straight to some pawnbroker to raise a sum of money. It happened. In 1832, someone pretending to be a French aristocrat stole a guitar and promptly pawned it. While in 1835, the Bristol Mercury records how a swindler somehow obtained a valuable guitar worth 8 guineas and took it directly to a pawn shop. Now, guitars deposited in circumstances like that were obviously not going to be redeemed, so they had the potential to join the supply stream of second-hand cheap instruments. But perhaps the most curious case of pawning dates from that same year in 1835. Concerns a young girl who apparently had white hair and purple eyes, if that's possible, you tell me, called Sarah Rixford. She appeared before a parochial committee in Whitechapel with an application to be taken to the parish workhouse. Struck by her looks, the gentlemen of the parochial committee put their hands in their pockets there and then and gathered some money to support her immediate needs. When asked how she'd kept body and soul together hitherto, she said that a gentleman had given her a guitar and lessons, but when the family lacked bread, she had pawned it for 8 shillings. Now, the author who commended guitars to the poor in the penny magazine for the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, I really have to give these titles in full because they are so telling, aren't they, on their own account, didn't want to endorse what he calls highly polished examples with mother-of-pearl bordering, but rather something of what he calls a more humble degree of finish, which might nevertheless discourse very tolerable music in proper hands, end of quote. He seems to be advocating an instrument specially simplified and priced for labourers and people in low-paid menial work. But in doing so, I think, don't you, that he underestimates the tenacity of working men and women for whom aspiration meant acquiring what someone else already had in the form in which they had it. In 1827, the Museum of Foreign Literature and Science printed a story I'm very fond of about a poor man whose wife had saved up fourpence, their whole remaining surplus fund, to pay for the baking, they didn't have an oven of course, of a shoulder of mutton and potatoes which they had in the house. Fourpence. On returning home from some errand, she found that her husband had spent it on buying a new string for his guitar. I don't know, my wife would find that really a very, very familiar story, one way or another. So in fact, he was prepared to go hungry so he could have a guitar string. Well, the lowest prices charged by most reputable makers of guitars, so there are people in the audience today who know much more about that than I do, but as far as I know, rarely went below 2 guineas, which is quite a lot of money. And even an instrument hanging on a bookstall in Pentonville Market, perhaps second-hand, cost £2 in 1831. Now that was 2 weeks' wages for a hairdresser, or someone doing various manual and clerical jobs in a warehouse, and a little less perhaps for a stonemason. But fortunately there are many traces of cheaper instruments. In 1819, a London music shop sold a Spanish guitar for £1, while in 1823 a guitar stolen, there it is again, stolen from the window display of Job Rutter, a musical instrument maker in Bond Street, was valued at just £1. Second-hand prices on the streets amongst the poor could be even lower. In his famous survey, London Labour and the London Poor of 1851, Henry Mayhew reports, and I quote, "Second-hand guitars are vended by the street sellers. The price varies from 7 and 6 to 15 shillings. He also says that, and I quote, "Among the purchasers of second-hand musical instruments are those of the working classes who wish to practice." And he reports on what he calls the duffing trade, a commerce in poor quality imported instruments. Now, how did those who bought cheap guitars but who were unable to pay for lessons learn to play? How did they even learn the 2 chords I mentioned earlier? Well, perhaps they turned to someone who was a family member or a friend who could already play. But what if no one like that was to hand? Well, I suggest that some may have learned by listening to the guitars that were increasingly played by street musicians. Many of them were children. If you look at the 3rd page of your handout, you have a detail from a coloured print of the mid-1820s, where you will see that there is a young girl who is holding a guitar, who is holding out a hat to get money from a very heavy gentleman who is distracted by her request and is about to tread on a baby. That we will just have to live with, I think. Henry Mayhew interviewed one busker who claimed to have been playing the guitar in the London streets from the age of 4, and I can well believe it. Well, let's look a little more closely now at the question of the music that poorer guitarists played. Some of the best evidence actually is really rather late for our purposes, but it's valuable nonetheless. One of the most curious of all the guitar tutors published in England is the collection of rudiments with melodies attributed to Don Thiebra, who is a known guitarist. Now, there's no date, but it's certainly Victorian because it includes a melody from Rigoletto, premiered in London in 1853. Priced at £1, the book was one of the cheapest guitar tutors ever produced up to that time and was surely intended at that price for players of very modest means. And in fact, a flyleaf in the book carries advertisements for even cheaper material, a series of 6-penny tutors for the concertina, violin, the cornet, and in fact the banjo. Well, once we look into this book by Don Thiebra, the concern to save money becomes very marked. Let me quote you a passage. "For very ample details of the rudiments of music, the student is referred to Bertini's Catechism of Music, published at the Office of the Musical Bouquet in which will be found everything that can be needed by the most inquiring amateur. The small price of this most useful work, sixpence, is a point not to be disregarded. But the most explicit passage is contained in the remarkable introduction. I quote, "In this workaday world, expense is a consideration, and it may be not unwelcome intelligence to many that a most respectable guitar can be procured for even less than a guinea. This, kept nicely clean, and slung round the neck by a ribbon, plain for gentlemen, as fanciful as fairy work for a lady, will suffice for beginners, whatever may be their position." What allusions to the workaday world or workaday existence are common in the 19th century, as you'd expect. Dickens, for example, refers to the real, hard, struggling workaday life. Readers who bought the guitar methods of the earlier 19th century with their engravings of gentrified women sitting with their instruments on expensive sofas or lavishly upholstered chairs would not have been flattered to be told they were part of the workaday world, nor, I think, would they have welcomed the reassurance that a respectable guitar, which they should keep clean, could be purchased for under a guinea. We are reaching down here, I think, to almost the street busker prices mentioned by Mayhew. Well, the pieces in Thiebra's book are presented in a very simple way. Two-note chords, often chains of parallel thirds and sixths, with a very clear melody. There's only one 6-note chord involving all the strings in the whole book, and the lowest string is hardly ever used. So I think both for price and content, this particular method, the one attributed to Don Thiebra, but I suspect probably not by him, seems to realize the ambition expressed 30 years earlier in the penny magazine for the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, and I quote, "The little that an ordinary player can ever hope to do on the guitar can be soon done. A very few lessons would suffice to enable the beginner to please himself and others." I'd like you now to hear a piece from Don Thiebra's book. For the moment, I'm going to keep the title back and keep it a secret. Perhaps you recognize that. I suspect many of you did. It's a very simplified version of Mendelssohn's Venetian Gondola Song, Opus 19, number 6, in G minor for the piano. Well, the material supplied for the novice guitarist in Thiebra's book includes similar arrangements of melodies by Beethoven, Donizetti, Mozart, Verdi, and Weber. These are the composers whose names appear again and again in the reports of lectures for labouring men and women, or in contemporary parlance, mechanics. In fact, the introduction to Thiebler's book claims that the guitar is an ideal accessory to a cottage concert. Now, that's a rare expression, unknown to the Oxford English Dictionary, and producing only a tiny handful of hits from the various newspaper archives. It might be unwise, I think, to be led astray by the idealism of the cottage concert, a famous painting by Charles Hunt, who died in 1877, which shows a man and a child making music in golden evening light that floods their decidedly rustic dwelling. In the examples from newspapers I have been able to find, a cottage concert means a concert arranged as part of adult education and self-improvement in a rural context under the aegis of some local association, often the parish clergy. The preface to the Thiebler Tutor therefore suggests that if the guitar is especially appropriate to cottage concerts, that it had found a home in a context like that. Well, this is not the only material that was printed with a very modest constituency in mind, and I ask you to look at the fourth page and final page of your handout. This shows the first page of an undated penny chapbook published by Catnach in the Seven Dials area of London, which you know was the great ballad publishing and broadsheet publishing quarter of London. He died in 1841 and was probably the greatest and most prolific publisher of cheap print chapbooks and broadside ballads. This is printed on the cheapest possible paper. I have the original. And it's a good example of the penny songbooks that were issued, save that this one is called The Guitar. It's got a vigorous but crude woodcut of a guitarist, certainly based upon a painting which I haven't been able to identify, perhaps some of you can, and gives the first, but in fact only the first song with musical notation. Now, as usual in penny sources where music is given, there's only a single line and certainly no accompaniment for the guitar or anything else. Now, I'd like, as my final example, and to close this afternoon, I'd like to end with a song that is in fact printed inside the book. The text is inside the book. The White Cockade by Robbie Barnes. I end with it because it tells of a young woman who will sell her rock, meaning her distaff, and her tow, that is to say her flax for spinning, and her cow, so that she can follow her lover with the white cockade, or cockade. I think cockade is the pronunciation required by the rhymes in the poem, which of course is the great Jacobite symbol for the return of the Stuarts. So you can see why I end with this. It is in many ways a song by someone associated with rebellion and activism, and is about the love of an impoverished person for, no doubt, another who is serving a particular and, in many quarters, a very controversial political cause. So here is the White Cockade.
My love was born in Aberdeen, the bonniest land that e'er was seen. But now he makes our heart full sad. He takes the field with his white cockade. Oh, he's a ranting, roving lad. He is a brisk and a bonny lad. Betide what may, I will be wed and follow the boy with the white cockade. I'll sell my rock, my reel, my tow, my good grey mare and orchid cow, to buy myself a tartan plaid, to follow the boy with the white cockade. Oh, he's a and a bonny lad. Betide what may, I will be wed, and follow the boy with the white cockade.
Thank you.